I'm Dr. Sean Murphy. I'm a surgical resident at San Jose St. Bonaventure Hospital.
When I first saw a promo for The Good Doctor, I was working at a small news channel and legitimately thought that it was some weird SNL skit that I didn't get the joke of. But no. And as a matter of fact, The Good Doctor was one of the most viewed shows from 2017 to 2018. Then it dipped. And it dipped hard. A lot of people initially had a very romanticized lens for the show, and many people kind of expected to see a modern, young, and fresh version of House MD. And, well, now viewers would rather watch reruns of House than the slop The Good Doctor has put in front of us. It's sort of hard to talk about the show The Good Doctor without talking about the Good Doctor himself, Dr. Sean Murphy, and the struggles he faces in the show. Coming from the creators of House, this medical drama features Sean Murphy, a surgeon who happens to have autism spectrum disorder, ASD, or just autism. And as the series progresses, we see him dealing with various issues, both personal and professional, as his career advances, at times because of his ASD, and at others in spite of it. A lot of the problems I've seen people have with the show actually comes down to how the show treats someone with autism, and that's sort of part of a larger issue. The commodification of autism. Hollywood loves to commodify autism, and honestly, it's getting very boring and absurd.
Bazinga!
At least that's what a lot of people with autism are saying online, particularly when it comes to shows like The Good Doctor. Don't get them wrong, representation of autism on television is a great conversation starter on a topic that is often dragged under the carpet. But for people with autism, there's a big trade-off. Do they deal with shows like The Good Doctor that get so much wrong, or do they just try to find better representation in different media? Well, good luck with that, because if you just Google best autistic representation in media, The Good Doctor comes up. And even with some of the more popular depictions of autism in popular media, many of these characters aren't outright stated to be autistic, leaving it up to the audience's interpretations. I mean, there are still whole threads on if House is somewhere on the spectrum or not. Hollywood has it in their mind that autism sells. Some characters like Sheldon Cooper, House, Monk, and Abed tell us that there's something inherently marketable about autism and other neurodivergence. Why? Well, the television approach for such characters has always been to show them as different, but that their deviance is always made up for with their unique gifts and talent, or their nearly unattainable levels of genius, or their almost unattainable genius mind. House is mean, bitter, and downright abusive, but none of that matters when his capacity to heal patients is almost godlike. People, especially those who are largely unaware of how autism actually looks or manifests itself, enjoy any notion of extraordinariness that is even mildly entertaining. That's the entire setup for House MD, which is sort of the progenitor or blueprint show for The Good Doctor. Both shows share the same creator, and in many ways, Dr. Sean Murphy was set to imitate his predecessor, House. Now, we should acknowledge that House has its own perils. From absurd, unethical decisions that House makes to medical inaccuracies, there are a lot of things you can criticize the show for. But House's unethical decisions are treated as unethical by the show itself. His unique mind is not used as a free pass to excuse or explain away his behavior. And let's be honest, every medical drama is going to have some medical inaccuracies for the sake of an entertaining story. Ultimately though, House's success and acceptance by the broader American audience has turned it into some sort of a throne bearer. This is why modern representations of an extraordinary doctor are still alive through shows like The Good Doctor. But you can't really compare the shows one-to-one. Anyone who loves House MD knows that The Good Doctor doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't have any resolve. And perhaps that's the problem of The Good Doctor. Sure, Sean Murphy runs into problems all the time, but what we're talking about is the overall conflict resolution arc for The Good Doctor himself. While House takes just as many steps backward as forward, getting clean and then relapsing, Sean just doesn't go anywhere to begin with, at least not anywhere interesting. The plot never thickens. Here's the thing, House MD has a problem. He's addicted to pills, and that sort of infatuation with painkillers interferes with his career and exacerbates his mean persona. You might remember the few times when his friends try to get him off the pills, or he even makes the choice to get clean for himself. That doesn't turn out to be good. His abstinence takes away from the very thing that makes House tolerable. His genius that makes a diagnosis that no one can. House's addiction is his Achilles heel, but it's actually a strength for the show. For a long-running show to be interesting, your characters actually need some source of conflict or drama. While it's a weak point for the person of House, it's actually a strong point for him as a character, and therefore a strong point for the show. On the other hand, Sean isn't struggling against an addiction that needs to be overcome. So what is Sean's problem that needs a fix? The obvious answer to the question is autism, which is something that can neither be solved nor should be labeled as a problem. Sean is who he is, perhaps with some unique challenges which could be a source of conflict or growth. But these are traits, not flaws, and that's a big difference. As a viewer of the show, we are explicitly engaged in a conflict resolution model in The Good Doctor, but that doesn't mean that the problem identification itself has any sort of entertaining value. For people living with autism, that would be a diabolical notion to think about. Imagine you tune in wanting to see people like you represented on screen, and then that character is depicted in such a way that isn't just inaccurate, but that the very thing they're representing is mishandled to this degree. So, if one were to watch The Good Doctor for the plot, there isn't too much of one, to be honest. What we see is a genius yet often misunderstood doctor, which isn't a new notion. But the problem arises when much of the time, Sean's autism-driven genius is the only real personality of the show. It always manifests in doctors disapproving of Sean's methods, only for them to be proven wrong. This back and forth between the doctors starts to get boring pretty quickly too. And I mean, there's always plenty of other things to watch on TV anyways. The Good Doctor Twitter tells us that it's exhausting to see Sean as the superhero, when in actuality, that is perhaps the most annoying stereotype attached to people with autism. Even if we're fine with seeing Sean as this savant, we fail to see what sets him apart. Everything about him is so extreme that it almost becomes impossible to see Sean the character. If anything, he ends up being a profoundly convenient plot device. Sure, people with autism tend to be socially isolated or face difficulty connecting with those around them, but The Good Doctor becomes an autistic experience that is almost alien-like. Not only does Sean not always seem accurately autistic, at times he barely seems accurately human. The bad representation of autism. Audiences also can't understand why Sean's autism is the only instrument available for the show writers. The autism itself very conveniently helps the Doctor with two things. Some sort of a memory booster because, wouldn't you know it, the person with autism can read and remember things. And secondly, Sean would look at screens and the autism would make him look at stuff that no one else can see or comprehend. These are obvious issues with the storytelling of the show, of course. But can we talk about the 3D graphics that supposedly show Sean's autism-driven thinking process? That sort of mind mapping is common in difficult genius shows like House or Sherlock, but in The Good Doctor it rarely makes a comprehensible point. It's almost a shame that the instrument in question only gets its most visceral complexity through weird and unusual ways. On one hand, we see that it is Sean's autism that makes him so brilliant, and in the very next second, he sounds like the very doctor who can be blamed for the brokenness of the American healthcare system. Hospitals and standoffish doctors are notorious for alienating patients and their families from themselves. Doctors are so caught up in their jobs that they tend to forget basic human tendencies. You might hate Dr. Neil for always assuming that Sean is a liability. The demonization of that thought process is pretty clear. But when the show capitalizes on the very same thing to give Sean some character depth, it becomes a problem. So was Dr. Neil right all along? Does the show even know what its own point of view is? Sean's autism makes him hyperbolically out of touch with the people around him and unable to have genuine connections. People with autism who once sought the show for its representation couldn't help but turn away. The Good Doctor has a tendency to show people on the spectrum just completely devoid of human connection. While there are people who experience such notions, the show is pretty good at putting a face on the autistic experience. This is why Sean isn't the very complicated character that the show wants to portray him as. Rather, audiences find him pretty binary in his conceptualization. It's his autism that makes him good, and it's also his autism that takes away from that goodness. If there was anything good about The Good Doctor, perhaps it was the conversation it started online about what autism doesn't really look like. So what we ended up seeing is the fears, misconceptions, and stereotypes of autism from a non-autistic faction of people. One of these fears or stereotypes is that people with autism are largely unaware of the world. That's why the show has a routine tendency to turn Sean into a raging transphobic racist. When the show's I Am a Surgeon scene got memed to death back in the day, more and more clips of the show resurfaced. And there were 2 episodes in particular that there's really no redeeming. The first episode is called She from the first season of the show. To jog your memory, this is when Sean interacts with a patient called Quinn, who is transitioning to become a girl. The entire episode is completely outrageous because a doctor, who is pretty good at his job, can't grapple with the fact that people deviate away from their biological sex. Sean misgenders Quinn all the time, and at one point he says, "Science says he's male." He kept reaffirming her biological sex too, just because that's what science says. The entire interaction is rewarded as Sean bombards Quinn with questions like if she likes the color pink or plays with dolls. In this scenario, the doctor's reaffirmation of biological sex doesn't come from his medical practice or affinity with science. The way the show labels his transphobia is by trying to entangle it with his autism. There could have been an interesting way to characterize Sean as being both transphobic and autistic without necessarily tying the two together. They could create depth and conflict and even a chance for Sean to change over the course of the episode. But since the writers decided that his transphobia and autism were one and the same, that couldn't happen. It's also kind of ridiculous the way the show treats the entire encounter, as if a doctor in the late 2010s would be unfamiliar with these concepts. The second case here is from the episode 7 Reasons. To jog your memory once again, this is the scene where Sean sees a Muslim patient and automatically assumes she's a terrorist simply because she was working with the chemical ethanol. The woman was making perfume. A fact we only get to learn because Sean believes she was making a chemical weapon. Do people with autism tend to pick up cues much slower? Of course. But when the episode aired, people with autism had to call out the show for creating narratives that weren't true to real life. Sean is from a small town in Wyoming. He probably didn't grow up around many trans people or people of different faiths. I mean, I lived in Nebraska for years, which is like here, close by. And that's basically what I saw. Giving him the chance to learn about the world and other people's experiences would be a great idea for episodes. Maybe even showing how his autism makes the process different than what it might look like for someone else. Maybe that was the intention, but what's on screen feels a lot more like the writers concluded that Sean's autism is the source for his discrimination. The biggest issue with The Good Doctor is that it became a learning cornerstone for non-autistic individuals. They watch an episode of the show and pat themselves on the back for the learning and awareness they've acquired through Sean Murphy. If you're looking for a show that actually does a good job of depicting a brilliant character with unique gifts, maybe check out my video on how Psych is the perfect modern Sherlock Holmes. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill, and of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.